Now look at what's happened to revenue. Trying to figure out where the opportunities lie. In 2008, total federal revenue was $2.52 trillion. In 2009, after the financial crisis, it dropped to $2.1 trillion. It was $2.1 trillion again in 2010, $2.3 trillion in 2011, back to $2.4 trillion in 2012. So over those 4 years, or 5 years actually, revenue is actually down from where it was in 2008. So we have, yes, we have a spending problem. We spend too much. We also have a revenue problem. And this is why we believe that we have to have a balanced approach in trying to deal with our deficit. So, what are the options here? Again, we propose what I consider to be a balanced approach. And I think we will get there at some point. But what are the other side proposal? And I'm on the budget committee. We passed this year in the House Paul Ryan's budget. This is the budget that Governor Romney has said he would sign. And here's what the alternative approach that we've considered. The Ryan budget extends all the current Bush tax cuts and replaces current individual tax system with a two-bracket system of 25 and 10%, similar to what Governor Romney's proposed independently. It makes the 15% tax on capital gains and dividends permanent. And this creates a reduction in revenue over the next 10 years of $5 trillion. So to pay for that, the Ryan budget, as well as Governor Romney, they say they're going to repeal unspecified loopholes that benefit special interests. Now, if you do that and you want to stay revenue neutral, the only way to do that, and this is independent analysts from all over across the spectrum, the only way to do that is to at least somewhat reduce, if not totally kill, the mortgage interest rate deduction, the mortgage interest deduction, the tax break for employer-sponsored health care, and the charitable deductions. There's just no other way to get there for that kind of amount of money. The Bryan budget also repeals the Affordable Care Act, which, according to the Congressional Budget Office, actually, if you repeal it, it increases the deficit by $250 billion over the next 10 years and $1 trillion more in the second 10 years. The Ryan budget cuts Medicaid by 1/3. 1/3 Medicaid spending, $5.3 trillion in federal spending total, but 1/3 from Medicaid. That would mean that in Kentucky over 10 years we would reduce the federal contribution to Medicaid from $4.4 billion to $3.1 billion, a $1.3 billion reduction in services and funding. Then all federal spending, aside from Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, would fall from 12.5% of GDP in 2011 to 3.75% of GDP in 2050, long time, which means you'd end up cutting everything else in government by 91%. That's college aid, Head Start, Veterans Care, all infrastructure spending, roads, research and development, small business loans, law enforcement, food inspection, border patrol, and air traffic control, and the FBI. I mean, those are examples where it would be cut by 91%. Now, I know that sounds dramatic, but the differences between the parties right now in Congress really are that dramatic. And here's what I said, and some of you have heard me say this before. We can't afford any more tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. Again, not after last few years when 93% of new wealth went to the top 1%. Not after Americans have seen their wealth plummet by 39% on average from 2007 to 2010, and their actual earning fall by about $7,000 for the same period. So if we're looking again, we're looking for a balanced approach. And I think we will get there eventually. Now, the other thing when you're talking about federal spending that I know some of you have heard me talk about is that we have this unfortunate habit in this country of trying to separate the public sector from the private sector. We think they're very different things. Well, they're not different things. If you look at this community, 9 of our 10 largest employers, that's to some extent, and and some, to a significant extent, rely on federal spending. The best example I can give you is Humana. Right now, 80% of Humana's business is administering government healthcare programs. 80%. And it's actually more than 100% of their profit because they lose money on their commercial business. So if you look at UPS, which has $1 billion contract with the federal government, and of course uses the infrastructure that only government can create. If you look at Norton's Healthcare, Jewish, Baptist, these, go down the line, and each of them, the University of Louisville, is dependent upon a significant amount of federal funding. So when you cut federal funding, you are hurting jobs. In the recent debate over the sequester, now we have people, Republicans say, mostly Republicans, some Democrats too, saying, well, you can't cut defense spending means jobs, which is absolutely right. So does spending in all these other categories. We're about to build 2 bridges and VA hospital. Those are a lot of it's federal dollars coming into our community that is supporting, will be supporting, private sector jobs. So it's not really useful to try and say government and the private sector are different things. We are partners, we have always been partners. There's a book out now called, well, it's been out for a while, called The Gardens of Democracy, and it's a whole kind of interesting, short philosophical track about the role of government and the idea of responding to the issue of people say, oh, we don't need a strong federal government, we need a limited federal government. And they say, if you want to look at limited government, look at Somalia and Afghanistan. That's what you get. And they also say, please try to identify a country somewhere in the world that has a vibrant democracy and a strong economy that doesn't have a strong central government. They don't exist. So the idea, again, that we can, as Grover Norquist said, shrink government to the size where it can be washed down the bathroom drain, I don't think that would be particularly helpful for our economy, certainly not for our community. The other debate we're having now is, and we see this all the time in the Budget Committee, we'll argue, for instance, about education. And everybody says, oh, of course we've got to support education. Some people say, but that's not the federal government's role. And we can get to the point where we're all kind of passing the buck from one government to another. But let me ask you this. Could the city of Louisville Metro, could they have come up with $600 million to help Ford retool the Ford assembly plant so that we can hire 3,100 more people and have the largest facility in North America? Of course not. They couldn't have come up with $600 million. The federal government created the loan program, which made that possible, and Louisville is the beneficiary of that. I mean, we can talk about these things all day, but there is and will remain a very, very significant role for the federal government. One of the other proposals I talked about was the constant move to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That's part of the Ryan budget. We celebrated the 2-year anniversary of the implementation of the patient protection provisions of the Act the other day. No more denials for pre-existing conditions, no more lifetime or annual limits on benefits, no more gender rating where women can be charged more than 50%, sometimes as much as 80% more than men for the same policy. And when we talk about benefits and liabilities from federal programs, an analysis has shown that of all the states, #1 beneficiary from the Affordable Care Act in terms of decreasing the amount of uninsured citizens is going to be Kentucky. We're #1 in terms of benefits from the Affordable Care Act. I think I may have said that one time before. Maybe that's true. So anyway, the frustrating thing is that we do have a lot of common ground. We have common ground. We believe that 98% of Americans shouldn't have their taxes raised next year. We do have common ground on, for instance, finding $716 billion worth of savings in Medicare over the next 10 years. We have a difference of opinion as to what we're going to do with that, but we agree on that. The problem with our common ground most of the time is that it's never common ground at the same time. Governor Romney was for the individual mandate when he was in Massachusetts. He was certainly, which was the model for the Affordable Care Act, and now he's against it, although yesterday he boasted about it in an interview because that shows his compassion. But the frustrating thing again is we have people who used to be for something, now they're against it, and who knows what will happen tomorrow. But I do believe that things are going to get better. I think we are at the bottom in terms of dysfunction. And I will say, here's the reason why. I do believe that both sides of the aisle are getting very frustrated doing nothing. I know that many of my Republican colleagues, and believe me, we all get along personally. It's nothing, it is absolutely not, this is not a personal dispute. And I have many friends that, where we couldn't, in Congress, we could not disagree more on issues, but we are still friends. And they're going home and their constituents are saying the same thing that mine are saying. You know, you all have to work together to get something done. And for those people who are in the Tea Party, they are now telling their members, you know, we may not like government all the time, but we need a government. We need one that works. We need one that works intelligently, smartly, so go back and make it work. So that's one reason I think we're going to actually start cooperating and get some things done. The second thing is that the country can't afford for us not to do that. These problems are real. I don't minimize them at all. But they are not unsolvable, and ultimately, I think the better instincts of members on both sides of the aisle will take hold and go to work. The other reason I believe that things will get better is because, depending on what happens 5 weeks from now, President Obama will either be a second-term president or he'll be a lame duck. But in either event, there will be no longer any reason for Republicans like Senator McConnell to make their top priority making sure he's a one-term president. They will either have succeeded or failed, but then they'll have to have another priority, and I think it will lead to move the country forward. So, you know, I'll just close with one item. We do have, aside from all these actual policy questions in front of us, we do have a significant structural problem in our government. At its optimum efficiency, our government was designed to move at about 20 miles an hour. The world's moving at 80 miles an hour. And we have to figure out a way to make our government much more capable of responding to the world that we occupy now. It is incapable of doing it. We've proven that time after time. Perfect example is financial reform, where we passed the Dodd-Frank Act 2 years ago. 50% of the regulations that were mandated in that act have not been written yet. Meanwhile, financial institutions all over the world are figuring out ways to get to do things differently and things that are outside the purview of the Dodd-Frank legislation. So we need structural reform. We need a citizenry that's actively engaged in helping us figure out the process. Because most of the time, we said process doesn't matter. Process matters dramatically now. And I hope that as the years go by, that we move to a government that is much more capable of dealing with the world we occupy. And I certainly hope to be a part of that, at least for the next 2 years. I would be remiss if I didn't ask for your support on November 6th, and so I can come back next year and the year after that. Anyway, with that, thank you for having me.